You mentioned earlier some classical authors, and I wanted to correlate. I want to parallel with that word classical compared to classical, the works of classics, especially the Greek and Roman classics. Our copies of the New Testament Gospels are vast, much more vast. We have over 6,000 Greek manuscripts to this day, and this is what Christian apologists call the embarrassment of riches, right? Uh, I love the work and the ministry of Dr. Daniel Wallace, and how he goes. Well, he's a bit older now, but how his team goes throughout the Europe and Middle East and finds all these manuscripts and takes them in digital form, and they're all available to be seen online for free. So I just want to say, to encourage Christians, just know that we have over 6,000 Greek manuscripts to this day. They occasionally find few of those. Um, that should encourage you, knowing that all these manuscripts are coming from different families, and correct, when the scholars compare them, they find some differences, but as scholars are saying, and theologians, that 99% of our theology is not affected by any of those discrepancies found when all those families of the Greek manuscripts are compared. Another so cool thing would be I didn't know, but the actually the very canon of the New Testament was started to being compiled by the church because they bumped into this heretic from the early second century whose name was Marcion. He was codifying, collecting the books in his canon, but because he was so biased and he was spreading heresy that the God of the Old Testament is not the God of the New Testament, he saw the God of the New Testament, or Jesus's father, as much loving deity. So in his canon of the, well, he completely rejected the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, he accepted only, I think, 10 or 11 books. It was the Gospel of Luke, and then shorter versions of the epistles, and which he heavily edited. And because of that, he was excommunicated from the church in, I have data here, in AD 144 as a heretic. But unfortunately, to this day, we have people who still believe that God of the Old Testament is not the same as the God of the New Testament. And based on Marcion, this is why this heresy is still called based on him to this day. Eric, I was wondering if there's anything you would like to say about this, but also another small sub question, if I can call it that way. What is, in your practice of reading and studying the Bible, the best way to deal with discrepancies? Because in one gospel you can see, oh, there are like two people. In another gospel you can see, oh, maybe there are like three eyewitnesses. We see all these authors of the gospels paying attention to different details. So what is your in your experience, what is the best way to deal with these so-called discrepancies or differences in the gospel accounts?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we could talk about discrepancies. First, you touched on a lot of different things there, and we can get back to some of those too. As far as discrepancies go, I would just say that we have numerous confirmation points that the gospel authors were trying to get it right. Like some of the examples that I gave you just right now from the book of Acts. Okay. There are numerous examples like that also in the gospels. There are numerous instances where, say, a gospel author makes an unexplained allusion to something that kind of raises a question, that another gospel author goes in and explains, but he does it in a way that's completely undesigned. And it has the ring of truth in the sense that it looks like they're just two people telling the same story, but they interlock in a way that they're not trying to fill in the detail for the other person, right? Which is a mark of truth. And maybe we can go through some examples of that. Because there are so many of those kind of instances where they just undesignedly, are corroborated either with each other or with secular history. That means, again, that they're probably close up to the facts, knowledgeable, and they're trying to get things right. Now, in any time you're dealing with eyewitness testimony, there's going to be some discrepancies. There's going to be apparent contradictions. And so it's not really a bug, it's a feature of eyewitness testimony, that's what you're going to have. And so contradictions don't really count as strongly against historical reliability as some of the facts that I would bring forward in making a positive case. And so you can't just look at contradictions in a vacuum. You have to look at the whole cumulative case for the historical reliability of the text. Then you have to consider maybe if there was a contradiction, but it was like a good faith error, a mistake, that might change us, that might cause us to rethink some of our theology regarding how we view inerrancy, or if we are still inerrantist or whatever. But it wouldn't undermine the core historical data that we have, right? It wouldn't undermine our case, really, if there was a good faith error, if there was a good faith mistake, right? Now, that being said, you hear scholars like Bart Ehrman who say, well, the Gospels are hopelessly contradictory, and there's just dozens and dozens and dozens of these contradictions, and so there's no way they could be eyewitness testimony. Well, for that person, I would say, go ahead, buy yourself a copy of Jesus Interrupted, and go through. Is it Jesus Interrupted, or am I thinking of a different book? All of a sudden, maybe it is Jesus Interrupted. My brain just went sideways here. I'll double check while we're talking here. But just go through his book and then actually read the text for yourselves, and you'll see that a lot of times the contradictions that like scholars like Bart Ehrman bring forward are just garbage. They're just ridiculous. So, for example, Bart says that like Matthew was so desperate to have Jesus fulfill prophecy that he misread something in Zechariah 9. And he had Jesus straddling two donkeys like some sort of rodeo clown during the triumphal entry. Well, if you actually look at Matthew 21:7, I'll read you the verse here and how he gets that. One second here. It says, they brought the donkey and the colt, and they placed their cloaks and sat upon them, or they placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. That's the NIV. Let me find the new American Standard here, a different translation. Yeah, they brought the donkey and the colt, laid their clothes on them, and set him on them. All right. Sorry, I'm gonna try that again here. He sat on them is basically what the way that it reads in the Greek. And so, yeah, here we go. This is the NET. They brought the donkey and the colt, and they placed their cloaks on them, and he sat on them, right? Well, what's the antecedent of them? Well, you could read it as he sat on two donkeys, but you could also read it as he sat on the cloaks. If you have any sort of charitable bone in your body, you would probably think, is Matthew an idiot? Does he think that Jesus, how did he do this, right? Did he strap them together? What's going on here? And so there's just kind of silly stuff that Ehrman does in order to generate contradictions like that are just kind of silly. And so if you could just like read the text for yourselves, like I said, and just think about it and not just take his word for it, a lot of times these contradictions will fall apart. Now, I do think there are a handful of things in the Gospels that really do look like contradictions that I might not know exactly how to resolve. But again, as I already stated, if that's all we have, that's not enough to undermine that these guys are trying to tell us the truth. And at worst, they made like a good faith mistake. It's not this hopelessly contradictory situation. Now, I could go through other, goofy examples of contradictions that Ehrman raises if you want. But if you look at them, a lot of them are just ridiculous readings, perverse kind of like harmonization where he tries to put two things together. He cherry picks to create developments. He says things like, I don't know, there's this anti-Semitic trajectory from Mark all the way to John. That's not even true. And again, we can go through some of these examples if you like, but yeah, when you just actually read Ehrman, it's kind of like, dude, you're either incompetent or you're dishonest, because like some of these examples that you're bringing forward are just like really, really bad. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you for mentioning Ehrman and some of the examples. I remember in my younger days when I heard about these things, and again, I'm not coming from a Christian home. I was raised as agnostic. in my early 20s, I started investigating. People were sharing the gospel with me, and then I decided if this is true, let me find out more. But even when I became a believer, I wasn't reading books. I wasn't into material knowledge, facts. I didn't know much. And then little by little, I will hear about all these good, smart, atheist objections, and it always bugged me that I wasn't able to find a good reason by myself of why do I believe ABC. So then I started investigating and learning more, and eventually I learned what apologetics is. I didn't know always, and when I was listening to some apologists, specifically when it comes to this idea of so-called discrepancies in the gospel accounts, uh, I remember that my heart calmed down once when I learned that these are not discrepancies at all. It was basically as if, for example, you as Eric are paying attention to, let's say, a sport event, and you're writing the whole essay, and then they ask me to write an essay. There'll be many similar things that we mentioned, but there'll be many details that you mention and I don't mention, and vice versa. And I learned over time that these are not contradictions. These are just uh, the things, the details that me as my with my personality and my character, I paid attention to more, and that's why I include them in my writings, opposing the way God made you as Eric, as yourself as individual, that you paid attention to certain details. So these things in the court of law actually would help either if we would be both invited to the court of law and there is a case of some criminal activity, and you will say, yes, I saw two people, and they will say, what, wait, Eric, you were further, I saw three people. That's not a contradiction. And we see a lot of these things in the gospels. Rather, you saw two people from your angle, but I was closer. Maybe the third person was in the car laying down, and because I was closer, I was able to see him or her, but you didn't. And these are not contradictions. Once when I learned this, a lot of weight fell off my shoulder. Of course, over time, another more challenging questions and topics came, and I always wanted to be the one who is buying books, reading articles. I'm always thirsty and hungry for more knowledge and more answers, and this topic helped me not to see these things as discrepancies. Bart Ehrman also loves to point there are close to 500,000 of discrepancies or differences between all those 6,000 and maybe close to 500 Greek manuscripts. Yeah, if you don't give any details and any background, that seems horrible. Like we should all abandon our faith. Are you telling me there are close to 500,000 of mistakes or differences between the Greek manuscripts? Then how can we have confidence we have the proper word of God? But then you have Christian apologists who come and say, "Hey, you're not telling the whole story. 99 of those differences are just misspelling, grammar mistakes, because the scribes 2,000 years ago, they didn't have electricity. They would fall asleep. They would misspell the word. They would sometimes write another letter twice, or would just omit. The same thing with words. So most of the discrepancies are merely grammar. There are a few complex and more challenging passages in the New Testament where Christian scholars agree or disagree, and they debate with each other. But none of these things are make us doubt the most fundamental doctrines of the Christianity, which are the Trinity, Jesus' divinity, Jesus' incarnation, and so forth. So for me, this brings me a lot of comfort and confidence. Do you feel the same?
I mean, yeah, sure. I think as far as the manuscript stuff goes, Bart Ehrman himself says, and this is in one of the earlier editions of Misquoting Jesus, page 252. He says, the position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position. Professor Metzger was his doctoral dissertation supervisor. They also co-wrote a book together. And he says that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. And so even Ehrman himself admits this. And so, again, the way that I kind of look at it is like, with all the different manuscripts, yeah, we have a bunch of manuscripts. I don't want to oversell it. Like most of the manuscripts that we have are older. But I don't think that most people really question whether or not we have the text. I know that Ehrman's whole book, Misquoting Jesus, is kind of to cast some shade on that. But at the same time, he just talks about he just focuses on a few meaningful variants that he thinks are important but ultimately, like you said, don't affect any Christian beliefs overall, unless you're like a snake handling Pentecostal church or something like that. If you think that's essential. So no, I don't really think that that's a super important issue. Um, Again, it goes back to, we could have tons and tons of manuscripts, but what is in the manuscripts? Are they historically reliable? Are they trustworthy? Are they written by eyewitnesses or people that we don't even know who they are, far, far away, long after the events, who might have been telling us some things that were real and embellishing a bunch of other details? And that's the skeptical view of the Gospels in a nutshell. Whereas I'm saying, no, we know who the authors are. We know that they're written within living memory of the apostles. And we have all kinds of small indicators that build up a cumulative case that show that what's being written actually does go back to what the original eyewitnesses said. And when you look at the big list of supposed contradictions, they're really just a handful of ones that are kind of interesting. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it surely does. I remember we covering this topic on my Bible intro class at Moody Bible Institute. I truly enjoyed this class because we were going through, things that we're discussing tonight. And again, I enjoyed the class so much.